Hello everyone, this is Elise. This time around, I'm bringing you listener stories again. Please stay tuned for next week when I'm planning again to do something a bit different. By the way, what did you think of episode 5, where I went into the history and meaning of the infamous number of the beast 666? I think I wrote it on the show notes, but for a second I did get a little bit spooked when I couldn't for the life of me get the word Antichrist to record properly into the episode. The last half, the part that says Christ, would either be almost muted or get very loud or slow and sound like a whisper, and then my voice, the tone would sound really weird. Even though I tried to adjust it, it was just, I don't know, something was off. I know it's just things that happen, but it did make for a bit of a laugh and, I don't know, a tiny little spooked second. Anyway, here is this week's story for season 1, episode 6 of And Then It Got Weird. So I've always had an attraction to the paranormal or anything supernatural, even as a young child. My babysitters made me watch A Nightmare on Elm Street when I was 5, and it just went from there. I've never been easily frightened. In fact, I'd say I've been frightened twice in my life. Once was when I thought my house was being broken into. It wasn't. And the other time happened when I moved to a house in Manchester at the age of 7. The house was big and creepy to look at, I guess, but my family never really thought so. My bedroom was tiny and it was all the way at the back of the house. My parents put me there because I was a sleepwalker, and being at the back of the house, they'd hear me walking around before I got too far. The other thing about me being there was it was dead silent at night because it was so far away from everyone else's room. My room had this big, thick framed window. They were old but very well made, and they also completely nullified outside noise. It was like being in a vacuum once my door was closed. My first night in that room left me feeling uncomfortable. I always felt like I wasn't alone in the room whenever I was trying to go to sleep. It unsettled me, but I never mentioned it or complained to my family. I'd been living there for about half a year with the same feeling more or less every night, and then one night I woke up for absolutely no reason. This was unusual because I'm a deep sleeper and it rarely happens to me, but I just felt like I shouldn't be asleep. Like there was a voice telling me to wake now. I sat up and my room was silent as usual and completely dark. It was always really dark on the floor space because my bunk bed and curtains completely drowned out the light. When I sat back up, I looked over the side of the top bunk. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. I lay back down and tried to clear the feeling that I was being watched out of my mind. I turned my head to look out the window and drew the curtains back, and immediately got the feeling I was being watched again, but closer, like someone had climbed half of the steps on my bed and stopped to look at me. I quickly glanced around again, but couldn't see anything, even with the moonlight and streetlights coming through my window. For the third time, I felt I was being watched and turned to the window again. An old man, probably in his late 60s, was standing on our garage roof. I immediately shut my eyes. Our garage connected to our house through a little cooler room, and the roof of that room was below my window. I told myself I was imagining things and opened them again. He was still there, but closer now. I could see his face clearly. He had deep set eyes that were brown, balding silver hair and graying stubble. He had a hooked nose and thin lips. The most bizarre part were his teeth. They were perfect, straight and white, but the moonlight hit them and it just made them look menacing. His attire looked old. It looked like a costume from Oliver Twist. He was dirty, covered in dry dirt or soot. I could only keep my eyes on him for a second or two before I closed them again. When I opened them, his face was pressed right up against my window. I either fainted or fell back to sleep and didn't wake up again until morning. When I woke, I was in my bottom bunk. I never slept on the bottom bunk, but I didn't even have a mattress or sheets on there. I didn't immediately remember the events of the night before and just assumed I'd been sleepwalking and stopped there. I went through my normal morning routine and got ready for school. My mom dropped me off and I went into a shop near my school to get some sweets before school. As I walked into the shop, all the events of the night before hit me. I remembered all of it, and it immediately shook me to my core. I was frightened, and I told the teacher, who called my mom, and she picked me up and brought me home. My mom reassured me that it was just a dream, but I knew it wasn't. It was weeks until I'd even step foot in my room again. Even longer until I'd sleep in there. Eventually, I did start to sleep in there again. I never saw the old man. I never even dreamed about him. But I did have another experience about a year later. This was part 1 of this submission, and part 2 will start right up. Stay with us. So to follow up about the story that I told you about seeing an old man on the garage roof of my childhood family home, I have another encounter. After having that encounter, I never saw him again. I never dreamt about him again or even really thought about him. But I did have another experience in the same house a couple of years later, which frightened me even more. This one stayed with me from the night it happened as a 9-year-old, all the way into adulthood. I still think about it regularly, not just because it genuinely shook me to my core, but also because I wasn't the only one to experience it in the house. As a child, I was very adventurous in my outlook toward fear and thrill-seeking. I'd watch every horror film I could get my hands on. I'd read the scariest novels in my parents' library. I'd throw myself willingly at anything that might have a chance of scaring me, and nothing ever really came close. Once I got into the upper ages of primary school, I started going out with my friends more and staying out later. My parents were very relaxed with my curfew. They knew me well enough to know I'd never put myself in danger or get into trouble, so I was generally allowed to stay out a lot later than the other kids in my group, who had to be home for around 7 p.m. The park we used to hang out around was further from my house than anyone else's, so I always ended up alone walking home. One night, I impulsively decided to take a different, longer route home. It led me past a cemetery. It was the same cemetery that a few of my relatives were buried in, so I was pretty comfortable being there. I stopped to look at the black gates guarding the entrance. They were huge, easily 3 times my height, and were in pretty poor condition. It must have been years since they were painted, or had the rust scraped off them. The gates were covered in moss, and the spikes mounting them had pierced an assortment of different colored leaves, and spider webs covered the tips of them, with threads connecting each spike. I wanted to go in, I don't know why, but something felt as though it was pulling me in. The gates were barred shut in the evening, so my only way in was to climb. I eventually talked myself into doing it. I was more worried about someone seeing me do it than any danger that might befall me while attempting to get over them. I was fairly athletic, so getting over it was no issue, and I was certain I hadn't been seen, even though my weight made the gates rattle loudly and violently. Once I was inside the cemetery, I just walked around, reading the names and ages of the people buried there, taking in when they were born and when they died. Like most cemeteries, the newer plots were at the front, so I started heading deeper to find older graves. I must have been walking for about 20 minutes when I saw a very unique looking headstone. It was about 10 feet tall and was shaped like an angel holding a baby with a young child standing beside her. The faces that had been carved into the stone had weathered away, leaving them featureless. They were eerie to look at in those surroundings, and with the sun having long since set. There was no noise except the rustling of the trees and the occasional sound of a car driving past the entrance. I knelt at the grave and tried to make out the names. There were 3, and they'd been dead for a long time. The name at the top of the list, which I won't mention, was clearly the mother, giving her age. The other 2 were younger, children. The elder of the 2 had died at the age of 8, while the youngest had only lived for a year. The dates of their deaths were the same. All 3 had passed away at the same time. As a 9-year-old, I understood how odd that was, but not that it could have been and likely meant they died in a tragic accident or a murder-suicide. While I was observing the gravestone, I heard a branch snap in the distance and behind me. I immediately jolted around and began scanning to see what had caused it. It was tough to see, but I couldn't make anything out. While my back was turned on the grave, the hairs on my neck tingled like someone had blown on them. It was enough to tell me I shouldn't be there and I needed to leave. I ran toward the exit and scaled the gates without worrying how much noise I was making. Once I was over the gates, I began making my way home. Occasionally, I'd take a look back to the cemetery through the cast iron bars. I was being followed. I was sure of it. The graveyard was pitch black, but I could still make out the silhouette of a person walking alongside me, but much deeper in. I quickened my pace, but the shape kept up, and it now looked closer than before, like it was walking closer toward me, but also still moving sideways. I ran across the road without looking. A car had to slam its brakes to avoid hitting me. The driver beeped their horn and glowered at me, angry at me. I paid her neat attention. I was only thinking about getting home as quickly as possible, and I ran the rest of the way. By the time I got home, it was pretty late. My mom told me to go get washed up and go straight to bed, and I did as I was told. I wanted to put my time in the graveyard far behind me and move on to a new day. While I was sleeping, I kept dreaming about the cemetery and the silhouette. While I was asleep, I kept dreaming about the cemetery and the silhouette that had moved alongside me. Then I dreamt about the silhouette walking through the streets of my neighborhood and heading straight for my house. In the dream, the silhouette headed straight into my house, up the stairs and to my room. I woke from the dream and stared at the ceiling. I could see a small amount of light coming through my door. It was ajar. I never slept with my door open, and once shut, it was impossible for the door to open without turning the handle. My room was as deathly silent as usual, but I could hear someone walking around in the darkness that was a floor space in my room. I peeked through the gap in the railing of my bed and could see the silhouette standing by my wardrobe, thanks to the light coming through the small opening of my door. I shut my eyes and tried to regain my composure. I could hear it moving around. The noise stopped, and the usual silence of my room at night returned briefly. It was broken by the sound of my bunk bed steps groaning under the weight of someone climbing them. I heard the first step, then the second, and then the third. I opened my eyes to look and saw the shape looking back in my direction from the top of the steps. For a split second, I was transfixed. It wasn't a silhouette anymore. It was a woman wearing a black dress with a veil covering her face. Her face had no features, just like the headstone I'd stopped to look at in the cemetery. Even without eyes, I could tell that she was looking at me. I threw the covers over my head and hoped that would be enough to hide me from her. It wasn't. I felt her weight shift from the steps onto the bed itself. I felt her edging closer to me. I could feel the weight of her on top of me. It was suffocating, crushing. She moved in the most unnatural way possible, more like a snake than a human. She was shifting up the bed and closer to my face until she stopped. I knew her face and mine were now level. I shut my eyes again and told myself no matter what happened, I would not open them again. My covers were pulled away and I could feel her breath on me. It was odorless and cold, like the breeze that squeezes under a door. After what felt like an eternity had passed, I couldn't keep my eyes closed anymore. I opened them and looked at her. She wasn't featureless now. I could see her. I could see her old freckled skin, her pointed nose and thin lips. Her eyes were closed, so tightly that they looked sealed shut. Only a second had passed before I let out the biggest scream I had ever managed in my life. I wanted to wake up every person on my street if possible. The woman slithered away without making a sound, without opening her eyes. I heard my parents' door open and the steps of my bed creaking. My mom and dad burst through my door and flicked my light on. As my eyes struggled to adjust, I could only make out the silhouettes of my parents and the woman. She walked right past them without them noticing. They spent the rest of the night reassuring me that it wasn't real. My dad took me back to my room after I'd started to calm down. I stepped in and saw a muddled footprint on my carpet. I pointed it out to my dad. He could see it too. I could see it on his face. He was uneasy about it. So he suggested I stayed in the room. Eventually, I managed to fall back to sleep. The next day, my parents agreed to swap our rooms around. I never experienced anything paranormal in that house again. We moved out about 2 years later. I know my dad was the one to convince my mom to swap the rooms. I didn't find out why until 3 years ago, when my dad passed away from cancer. In the evening of his funeral, me and my family stayed up talking about our lives together. My mom mentioned what happened that night, and I told everyone who didn't already know the story. When I finished it, my younger sister, who wasn't alive at the time that the story happened, and my mom shared a look. I asked them what it was for, and my mom told me that my dad had seen something almost identical to my experience. The same woman, the same feeling of her crawling toward him on the bed and just staring at him. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to frighten me more about the whole thing. And once we'd moved and time had gone by, it was no longer something to even talk about. According to my mom, he'd seen the woman wandering around the house many times after that night. My mom believes in the paranormal, but has never experienced anything herself. But she always said me and my dad were very receptive to things like this. The woman has haunted my dreams so many times over the years. And even now, despite the fact that I live hundreds of miles from that home, there are times where I feel like she is still watching me. There are times where I can see a silhouette on the other side of the road. Only when I turn my head, there's nothing or no one there. To this day, I'm convinced that woman haunted my dad and is still doing the same to me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Thank you to my contributor for today, and as I always say, don't forget to subscribe. Please review and rate also if you have time. And if you know a friend that would be interested in listening, please let them know. This is a small operation I'm running, and I'm having so much fun creating and editing, and I can't continue without your support. Also, if you're interested in chipping in to help cover hosting and other podcasting costs, you can chip in on my Patreon, and I'm also on Ko-fi, and this information is in the show notes. But the most important thing you can do is keep listening and subscribing, and also don't forget to follow me on Instagram at itgotweird.podcast, where I post stuff related to my life here in Japan as well. I also stream the episodes on YouTube for those of you that prefer it to running an app. Stay tuned as I upload new episodes every week. I really appreciate your support. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode, where it will be, again, another bit of a shift to what I have been doing so far. Anyway, wherever you are, good morning or sweet dreams. This has been Elise with And Then It Got